Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today I'm joined by consulting economist Julie Fry and New Zealand Institute of Economic Research principal economist Peter Wilson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Today we're talking wellbeing. This is something Treasury has been working on since 2011. It's basically been thinking of ways to encourage the government to consider more than just GDP when it makes policy. So the new government has come in and said it's keen on a refresh on this and keen to take the idea on board. And at the same time, Julie and Peter have been working on a book called Better Lives, which looks at applying this wellbeing framework when creating policy around migration. I'm just wondering how using a wellbeing framework would see different outcomes for migration policy to using this sort of GDP-focused framework we've been using up until now.
So, Janae, when we talk about our original migration objectives, which is to bring in people who can contribute to New Zealand's economy, we tend to look at young, healthy people who can come in already trained, who can contribute the most to the labour market. If we think about well-being, we might bring in a different group of people. And if you consider under our existing framework how we view the parents of migrants, they are often seen as a cost we might want to avoid because people come in, they don't pay taxes, they're going to need to access superannuation, they might need higher cost healthcare and elder care later in their lives. So in the sort of GDP maximising framework, we tend to think of this as a group of people to avoid. But if we were thinking about well-being, we might consider the benefits that this group of people can bring in. You would think about grandmothers, for example, being able to help provide childcare for their children or helping their grandchildren with staying connected to their culture or their language. So you can see that a wellbeing framework enables you to think about different things being important, and it might lead you to choose different people.
Sure, so it's kind of just, it's more holistic, and the Treasury's identified 4 capitals, which it's called natural, social, human and financial. So basically there's a list of indicators that it's working on identifying and then getting policymakers to look at that list when they make policy and as you're saying, could see some quite different outcomes. How would this affect the way we approach international students, for example?
Well, international students are another prime example of they're great for GDP, and the previous government really increased the number of international students coming in because, again, they're young, they don't use health care, they don't get benefits, but they pay a lot for their migration, for their education. But if you think about well-being, you'd start to think about, well, what impact is this having on the students themselves? Because some of them come in here with very unrealistic expectations that they're going to get permanent residence and get citizenship when they're not. You'd also start to think about the effect that these people are having on the labour market because they're highly educated people with work rights who are probably competing for people who would happily take jobs. So again, you're thinking about whose well-being are you thinking about? You're thinking about the students, you're thinking about other people there competing against, and the GDP stuff as well, and saying what's the best balance of those 3.
So what would you suggest would be the best way to handle numbers of international students taking this broader range of factors into consideration?
And one of the things we stress in the book is that you shouldn't just cherry pick those 12 criteria and say, well, students have a negative impact on the housing market because they have to live somewhere. You've got to put it all together. You've got to put together housing here. But I think you might start to think that maybe you'd want to make sure that the students were getting a very good education, so quality education, as opposed to some of the short-term language schools, and that they've really got a prospect of genuine employment afterwards. So you target more on their well-being after migration, after education, rather than just thinking of them as a cash cow that'll boost the economy while they're here and then we don't care what happens to them afterwards.
Sure. Okay, so using your framework, would you reduce the number of, do you think we need to reduce the number of migrants? Or is that too simple?
I think it's too simple and too quick, but we'd want to look at the composition more than the numbers and say, do we have the mix right? So maybe some more grandmothers and some fewer baristas. as opposed to a global number.
Sure. Okay. Look, I mean, this sounds great, and no doubt when people hear this, they think this is fantastic, because essentially, if you have, people are happier, you've got your more of your family members here, you're going to be happier, which means you might be more productive part of society, which is good for everyone. And these things are not black and white. It's not just money or GDP. It's other things to it. In practice, though, is it just kind of adding another complexity to the policy-making process, having this framework that policymakers have to sort of tick off?
I think it does make it more complicated, but it also leads to better results, and that's a trade-off that we are suggesting is worthwhile making in the book. So at the moment, we just primarily focus on GDP impact, and sometimes we think about labour market impacts, and sometimes we think about housing impacts. But we don't do that in a systematic way, and we don't think about all the things that people care about when they're living a life they value. So we don't think about environmental impacts or impacts on the Treaty of Waitangi or impacts on work-life balance. We don't think about all the things that go towards contributing to people living a good life. And that means that we are setting policy that isn't based on the things that matter. We're missing out important things, and that makes it hard to get things right.
Sure. How do we... obviously, when we use this framework, there will be trade-offs. So, different people might put more emphasis on different aspects, whether it be the environment or jobs or anything like that. I mean, how we could keep talking round and round in circles if we're trying to, put enough emphasis on each indicator. How would policymakers make those trade-offs or decide how to do that?
The book's called Better Lives for a reason. It's not perfect lives. Yeah. And what we're looking for is an improvement on the current process. Ministers and public servants are making these sorts of trade-offs all the time, but they're often doing it in a very untransparent way, and often in a very unpredictable way. So you don't know how much the government weights the environment versus jobs. What we're talking about is surfacing those things and encouraging ministers and officials to be more transparent and to say, we do put more weight on the environment than the previous government, so that explains our decision, and so the decisions can become more predictable. So if something changes, government makes an announcement, everyone says, yeah, we knew that was coming. So that's what we're after, whereas at the moment it's very opaque. You don't know what is influencing ministers, and they should make that more transparent.
Okay, so that is a key point, because there's possibly an argument that governments already consider more than just GDP when they make decisions. I mean, if we look at the decision made on oil and gas recently, that is a clear sign that the government has taken other factors, environment, so on, into consideration as it's made a policy decision. The thing with this framework is that it just makes it more transparent from the get-go.
Absolutely, yeah. It makes it more structured and it makes it more clear, and it gives people who may not agree with the priorities and the emphasis they've put on these other components a chance to say, oh, I see that you weight that more highly. Here's my reason for arguing that it would be better to weight employment more heavily or the environment more heavily. It gives everybody a chance to have their say in a way that's more structured. Okay.
Realistically, though, we see governments sometimes make pretty quick calls on certain issues, and, arguably, once again with this oil and gas issue, while it has been signalled in speeches, only over quite a short period of time, there hasn't been a really huge consultation process or anything like that. So is it realistic that policymakers will actually have the time to go through and really flesh out ideas according to this framework in reality?
I think they will. If you look at the moment, lots of government's decisions in New Zealand are made on the basis of consultation documents and white papers. So we're just often, what we're really suggesting is that those trade-offs just be made explicit and that they're mentioned. It shouldn't just become a checklist that says, oh, I've talked about the environment and I don't care about it. I've ticked off work-life balance. You have to do some work. It does make decision-making more complex, but we think it leads to better, more transparent, more accountable decisions. and that's a price worth having. And it also makes it easier for people like you to hold the government to account, to say, hang on, last time you said the environment was important, this time you put more emphasis on jobs. What's happened? What's changed? Or are you just making stuff up as you go along, or just bending with the will and being unpredictable?
Sure. Okay, Peter Wilson, Julie Fry, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about this. This is something which I think there'll be a whole lot more discussion about in coming years as Treasury really fleshes out what this framework is going to look like, and it'll be interesting to see how the government applies it in different areas. So thanks for coming in. Better Lives, it's a book I suppose is worth a read, and it's a very pertinent time to read it. So I'm Janae Tibshirani from interest.co.nz.